In this clip, I will mention a little about the advantages of the cluster text, make an estimate of how considerate they may be, and I will also mention a little about the disadvantages of the rectangle text. For cluster text, the longer lines of 95 characters leads to a better immersion, as you are not constantly interrupted by many unnecessary and bad line breaks. In the past, it was believed that you miss line changes for text with line lengths greater than 75 characters. But it is relatively easy to show that this is not the case. If you read a cluster text, you will not miss a single line change. We can assume that longer line length give an immediate improvement of 3 to 5%. This is due to, among other things, the fact that the amount of line changes are reduced. The larger center spacing provides a better perceptual support. The central point of our gaze, the center of our attention, prefers to end up on the fourth letter in a new sentence or on a new line. This means that when a cluster space ends up a bit to the right in the reading span, our gaze can move past it to the fourth letter in the following sentence. In addition, our gaze does not have to jump back to the previous sentence in the case of a regression. Regressions are the involuntary leaps back that we don't realize we are doing when we read. Troubled readers may experience 10 to 30% regressions as they read, and advanced readers just a few percent. If some of these are avoided, we have reached an improvement. In the cluster text, equidistant word spacing is used, which also might help a little. Overall, we can assume that also this immediate improvement is 3 to 5%. The perfected line breaks also help our reading. In cluster text, single words to the right are moved, and our reading also flows better if the other appropriate words are moved to the next line. You can also experience a somewhat better constitution of meaning, which means that you don't experience as many hiccups and that you don't have to rethink as often. Words that are closely connected, the brain can adapt to in a better way, such as when an and the are moved to the line below. Overall, we can assume that the perfected line changes also provide an immediate improvement of 3 to 5%. Thus, we have taken into account three big immediate improvements: the longer line length, sentence spacing, and the perfected line breaks. All other minor improvements we can perhaps also assume to give an immediate improvement of 3 to 5%. One example is the margins. If we avoid moving our thumbs and avoid reading curved text, we may be able to read a little faster with a little better fluency. The slightly higher speed also means that the pages can be slightly larger, which means that we avoid a number of page turns. There are twice as many words on a cluster text page compared to a regular rectangle text page. This means that advanced readers don't have to turn the pages as often. If you read at roughly 500 words per minute, you can still read for 3 minutes without having to turn pages. If we now add all the immediate improvements of 3 to 5%, i.e. 4 times 3 to 5%, we reach a total immediate improvement of 12 to 20%. This improvement may be both greater or lesser and may also vary between different readers. I mentioned the assumed percentages mainly as an orientation. When you test reading cluster text, you can see if they hold true. Now we've covered the immediate improvements. There are also many indirect improvements. One example concerns the length of the reading sessions. You might read for 22 minutes instead of 20. This gives an improvement of about 10%. The pauses between the reading sessions may also differ. They will perhaps take 12 minutes instead of 15. That gives another 10% improvement. We could possibly also read in 10 sessions a day instead of 9. That's another 10% improvement. If you can also manage to read almost an extra day a week, it adds another 10%. And as before, I'm just assuming the percentages. They may be larger or smaller, and they may differ between different readers. The cluster text can thus possibly be significantly better than the immediate improvement of 12 to 20%. It can actually be twice as large, i.e. 24 to 40%. And not only that, it may also be necessary to take into account that readers may start to read more. If this happens, it can lead readers to increase their basic reading speed. Assume the basic reading speed for rectangle text was 200 words per minute for certain readers. If they then read more with cluster text, it could possibly be increased by 10% or more. Assume that the immediate improvement provides a speed of 240 words per minute. If you then choose to read more with such a reading speed, it may be increased through the actual training to 280 words per minute. That kind of improvement may therefore also need to be added. When you read at that speed for a whole week, the improvement might be 50%. Thus, you will get a larger week span with cluster text. The immediate improvement in words per minute can thus be 10 to 20%, but in week span, it could possibly be considerably larger. Another effect you may have to take into account is if people switch from poorer and slower activities to reading. If you used to listen to lessons, lectures, and audiobooks, you might be able to replace them with reading. Then the improvement may be 100%. You can go from listening to approximately 150 words per minute to reading with 300 words per minute. And from listening to a couple of thousand words a week to reading many hundred thousands. There are more possible improvements, but I suppose it has become clear enough that the improvement could be quite substantial depending on how you look at it. One example of a more complex improvement is that you can read more in a day, and then it may be easier to comprehend the text. If you have fresh in mind what you read on page 30, when you get to page 300, it may be easier to comprehend a text. When we read, we forget things quite quickly. Within a day, most people have forgotten most of it. If we avoid experiencing that, the improvement can be even more significant. You should also be more alert while reading, which also should contribute to a further improvement of one's comprehension. There are also improvements concerning the usage of a text. As the pages are a little larger, you are encouraged to take notes. If you get better at doing that, learning could also get better. In the past, many read a text repeatedly, which is often an ineffective method. If you highlight the central points and make sure to use a proper retrieval practice, you can hopefully remember more. In conclusion, a cluster text can thus in various ways lead to a slightly better and more effective reading and learning. Now we can apply these thoughts to education. In fact, a 5-week college or university course rarely involves reading more than a couple of books totaling 1,000 to 1,500 pages of rectangle text. At least this is the case in Sweden. It gives about half as many pages of cluster text, which advanced readers can read quite easily in 2 days. Then you probably don't need to attend any lectures either. If we make sure that pupils practice their reading really well in school, we can therefore greatly improve the conditions for higher education. If we are to start weighing in such effects as well, the improvement with cluster text can be quite substantial. Now let's get back to the immediate improvement. In general, we can understand it as if the cluster text reduces the perceptual and cognitive load. It reduces the number of bad perceptions, which facilitates cognition. When that happens, we can then see if it leads to all the other improvements. Note, however, that this assumes people are actually reading. If people don't read, there will be no improvement at all. Now I have described the cluster text. Conversely, I will also describe why the rectangle text does not work particularly well. The lines in a rectangle text are too short to reach an immersive reading. There is a lack of perceptual support between sentences, and many lines and sentences are broken in the wrong places. Not a single line break is improved. In addition, the distances between the words vary, which can also be disturbing. Even the hyphenated words may have a negative effect. Regarding the spread, the margins are not very good. Often the inner margin is too small so that you are forced to read curved text. The bottom margin is unnecessarily large and you can still not take notes in it. The thumbs cannot fit in the outer margin, which means that you are forced to do countless thumb movements, and the top margin is often too small for notes. The rectangle text spread looks good if you get used to looking at it, but it's not very good to read and use. The pages contain a small amount of words, often around 300, so you are forced to frequent page turns. And not only that, you are also forced to look for the page numbers in the wrong place, i.e. they are often placed at the bottom of a page. Overall, all this prevents an immersive reading. You never achieve a good reading fluency, nor a good reading speed, and neither any good uses. A book page with rectangle text is still relatively good in comparison with other text. There are text in magazines and newspapers that are significantly worse. This also applies to many text on screens. Some text can take up the entire screen on large screens, and others are cut off, becoming too short as on our phones. For screen text, the screen itself produces a worse reading. For all these rectangle text, the immediate speed is reduced, and moreover, you can't read them in equally long sessions. You have to take slightly longer breaks. You can't bear to read as many sessions a day, and not as many days a week. If you also read in a language that you don't really master, such as English in Sweden, then the reading training and the reading speed you thus acquire will suffer even more. It can get so bad that many prefer to listen to audio files and attend lessons and lectures, which means that you will lose further time and reading ability. Many pupils in school and students in higher education barely reach speeds of 200 words per minute anymore. They read very little within school and education, and even less outside them, at least in Sweden. And when they read, they often read bad text, for example short messages or other cut-off texts on screens. One can clearly state that the situation is deplorable. Now I have made clear the advantages of the cluster text and also the disadvantages of the different rectangle text. You may need to describe and understand the possible improvement in several different ways. The immediate improvement could be 12 to 20%, and the improvement could be more than 100% depending on how far one broadens one's perspective. Don't forget this when you express how much better a cluster text really is. Now note that it is possible that the exact cluster text is possibly the only text that is correct or true. This may be difficult to realize as you have got accustomed to many different texts. You have probably got used to and normalized the variation, so to speak. But all other variation of text may be incorrect and thus wrongly written. In the future, you should therefore possibly make sure to always write an exact cluster text and not keep changing different aspects that will make a text a little worse to read and use. It is perhaps text with a column width of 13 centimeters and a line length of 95 characters together with EB Garamond size 10.5 that is always best to read. Maybe we shouldn't even change typefaces and so on. You have to think about whether this seems right and take it into account accordingly. Note in particular that you should perhaps follow what is most suitable for advanced readers. In the next video, I'll cover what you need to consider when you are trying to figure out whether a certain cluster text really is the best text. Of course, you should not trust what I have mentioned this far, even though it sounds reasonable. You should try to determine where it's reasonable by properly testing the cluster text on your own.